students are on the computer in the classroom, and it looks like a couple are remoting in. And I know that I also want to welcome, I should introduce myself to the SURE students. I'm Dr. Nancy Gersick. I'm a professor in the College of Kinesiology, and I am running the honors seminar for our wonderful College of Kinesiology students. We've got about 15 students in our program. They're going to be doing verbal presentations of their research proposals in November. So if any of the SURE students want to come by and see it, just get in touch with me. You can email me and I can let you know the dates of their presentations. And I also want to thank Dr. Massie for coming over virtually to speak to our wonderful group of students, both in the SURE program and then our honor students in kinesiology. And for our kin students, Dr. Massie is the coordinator of our undergraduate research initiatives at the University of Saskatchewan, and she also coordinates with the SURE program, I believe. So I'm really thankful that you're able to make time in your schedule, Dr. Massie, to do this, and looking forward to the talk. And Dr. Massie and I talked about, relative to when to ask questions. She'll present and then save about 15 minutes for questions. People who are live here, you can still pop your questions into the chat box, and SURE students, you're welcome to ask questions obviously as well. So I'll turn the mic off, Dr. Massie, and turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that the sound is good, and I apologize for coming to you remotely today. Normally I would be in person if I could, but I work from home and I live an hour outside of town on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So this was the compromise that we came up with, but I really appreciate being invited to come in today. So with that, I'm going to get going on the presentation and get my computer actually moving forward. That is a good thing. There we go. So as a settler Canadian of Scottish, Irish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Ukrainian tradition, I am filled with gratitude to live within Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I give respect to the First Nations and Métis of this place and continually value our interconnectedness through Wekutuwin. I too love this land of vast skies and tall trees, Saskatoons and blueberries, and the swift and slow waters of the Saskatchewan River. And the picture is me this summer on same said Saskatchewan River. So I had a chance to work with the Guanamaw Center to develop my own personalized land acknowledgement. And if you send me an email, you'll see it on my email. So who is Merle Massie? I am a triple graduate of the University of Saskatchewan. I had a double honors degree in English and history, and then history offered me more money to do graduate studies. So I went and I did my graduate studies, my master's, and then my PhD in history. So I am a professional historian. I'm also a farmer. My husband and I farm in West Central Saskatchewan. I am an award-winning author. I've won 2 Saskatchewan Book Awards for 2 different books. I'm a dog and a cat owner. I am a spouse. I am a parent. And at the University of Saskatchewan, I am the coordinator of the Undergraduate Research Initiative. It is in the Office of the Vice President Research. So that's who I am. And I've been asked here today to give you guys some good tips and tricks around giving an oral research talk and how to break that down and what that looks like. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the 3 things that I want you to kind of remember as we go through today, and we'll come back to them, don't worry, I repeat things a lot, but the 3 things that we're going to be talking about is serving a non-specialist audience, storytelling, salesmanship, and conversation, and how to build that into as part of your research talk, and then practice, 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 practice. This is one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. There are 2 types of speakers, those who get nervous and those who are liars. Every time I go to give a research talk, and I give lots of them, I give public research talks, I give academic research talks, I've been on the radio, I've been on television, I've been in all kinds of places, I've been recorded on podcasts, I've been recorded in all kinds of spaces, and every single time I get nervous. It doesn't matter how many times I've done this, I get nervous. And so at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I do to try and overcome that nervousness. One of the first things I know that students will forget to do is actually introduce yourself. And so that's why my presentation starts with that, and I introduce myself. When you go to do your research presentation, even though someone will say, okay, and next up is, Jane Doe, and up you stand, and they're like, okay, well, you just got introduced, right? So you just dive into your research talk. If you can pause and not do that, say who you are, what do you study, and what you're presenting today. It is a really good place to start. And the reason why you do that is that it creates a sense of connection. It draws the audience into you. They get a sense of who you are. And it's just a sentence. It's nothing serious, but just take that 3 seconds to just explain who you are and why you're up in front of them today. So it's something that students often forget. So I'm going to put it in my talk to remind you to do that. One of my favorite overviews of research stories, or really an analysis of research stories, actually comes from my work with government relations here at the University of Saskatchewan. And they talk about when they take USask research to the government, these are their 3 things that they always want to make sure are embedded in a research talk. They want to make sure that if they're telling the government about research, they want that research to be memorable. They need it to be understandable, and they would like it to be repeatable. And so I bring that to you, and we're going to talk about that again, simply because when we're done at the end of today, I want you guys, if you see me in the hallways at USask, and you'll go, oh, that's Merle Massie. She's the one that gave that presentation about oral research talks. Awesome. That's what I want you guys to remember today, is that I want to be memorable, I want to be understandable, and I want to be repeatable. I want you to be able to go, oh, did you hear Merle Massie give that talk about research, giving oral presentations? You should go watch that on YouTube. That's what I want you guys to remember, is that it's not about the technical details. It's like, oh, that big picture stuff. So having said that, as students, this is where you guys often get stuck. And I understand, because students are always far more worried about how smart we sound as students, because we want to get those good marks. And I get that. But communication is the art of working with your audience to understand something. And so where you need to be is over on the right-hand side. Your goal is to make sure that your audience understands as much as possible the first time you present it to them. We get caught up in that how smart you sound. But even if you're presenting in a really, really technical audience to a professor who's marking, you still want to pitch it as high level as you can, because you want your audience to understand you. Because even those really smart professors who are in the room listening to you give your presentation, they've got 52 other things that they're doing. They're judging, and they got an email coming in, and their phone is pinging, and they got other things going on. And so your job is to make your research talk as easy on them as you can. And your job is to guide them through what you did. And so that's what we're going to break down today. So there are 3 parts. Every presentation that you give, every time you talk, there are 3 things going on. There's you, the speaker. So that would be me in this case. I'm the speaker today, but you, the speaker. There's your message, what you've decided to talk about, or what you need to talk about today, what you've been asked to talk about. And there's your audience. And it doesn't matter if it's just you and your mom having a conversation about, what you did this past weekend, or hi, Dad, I'm running out of money, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Every single conversation has these same 3 parts. There's the speaker, there's the audience, and there's the message. And each of these is critical, and each shapes the other one. So when you're the speaker, you bring yourself, your imperfections, the things that you do. I talk with my hands a lot. You bring that to the stage. So you kind of have to learn it and own it, embrace that. Your audience brings themselves. So each of you brought yourself to today, and whatever you are thinking about today, whatever you're worrying about today, you've brought all of that. You're watching your watch, you're concerned about timing. All of that is part of who you are. And you need to meet your audience where they are as best as you can. And with these 2 things in mind, yourself and your audience, that's where you learn how to craft your message. And so we're going to go through each of these 3 things: the speaker, the audience, and the message. And we're going to start with audience. So in this, it's the bottom. So the audience is who you're talking to. And even if you're presenting to your class, you still need to pitch your work for a non-specialist audience. Your challenge always is to explain your work to a non-specialist audience. The golden rule is that every audience is a non-specialist audience. Don't assume that your audience knows everything that's going on in your head or everything that you figured out in the background. Assume that you're talking to a fresh, brand new audience who knows nothing about what you're going to be talking about. It will serve you 98% of the time, and even 100% of the time. Because when you pitch what you're doing, when you know your audience, you can pitch to that audience. So what is their background knowledge? You don't have to go all the way down into what is kinesiology, right? So you recognize that they know that. So you can go up a couple levels from there, but you do need to pitch your talk to the person with the least amount of subject matter knowledge in the room. What I do is that I tend to assume that I'm going to explain everything that I do to my aunt, and she's, university educated. She's in her 70s. She's very smart, but she doesn't necessarily know all the bits and details of what my work is as a historian or my work is as a communicator. So you can craft your research talk to suit those expectations for the class. Take a good look at the rubric. Make sure that you don't forget that. So if they've given you, because this is your presentation for kinesiology students is for a research class, it's for 490, there's probably a rubric out there. Make sure you pay attention to what they're looking for and follow those guidelines if you're going to be judged on that. Think through that. But even with that, it's still best to pitch your talk to the person with the least amount of knowledge. What that does is that it connects what you're talking about with everyone in the room, and it brings them along with you. So you're not talking at them, you're presenting with them. It's like, then we did this, and then we did that, and this is what we learned. And it becomes more of a sharing rather than talking at them. So that's one of the things that you can think about. When you think about your audience and you break it down, this is what you're going to be, the three areas that you're going to be doing. First of all, you're going to be showcasing your mastery of the subject matter. Now, being a master doesn't mean that you have to reveal everything. It means that you know your stuff so well that you walk alongside your audience and explore that research with them and tell them what you did and what you learned. So you're going to reveal your mastery of the subject matter via storytelling devices. And some of those storytelling devices include knowing your audience. So today I know that in the audience are kinesiology students in their 4th year or in a 490 class. You're about to give a research presentation about 10 minutes long. And so you kind of want some ideas of how to do that. I also have the Shore students here, or some of them, and they may be watching this online afterward, and they may be having to give a research talk. Maybe they've got to give a poster presentation. Maybe they have to record their research talk. So know the audience, connect with that audience, use some stories, use some storytelling devices. I'm using some images, I'm using PowerPoint, but you're going to use the storytelling devices. But here's the kicker. You also have to remove the unnecessary details. So the unnecessary details are things like jargon. So really, really highly technical words, numbers, maybe some high level numbers, but don't get into the weeds of 2.2% of this and 5.7% of this. That is considered minutia, particularly in an oral research talk, because you'll lose your audience. There's always going to be someone in the audience who can't remember just what you said a minute ago, or maybe they zoned out for 10 seconds because like their phone buzzed and they, oh God, I got a text. Who's that from? And it takes them a second to get their brain back on track. You've lost them, right? Like if they had to listen to every single second of what you've done, you've lost them. So if you can remove those unnecessary details, keep them in your written stuff or keep them on the screen, that's fine, but they're not necessarily part of the oral stuff going on. If you've got them on the screen, then they can kind of go back to it and fill things back in. But when you do that, when you do these three things, show your mastery of the subject matter, use those connecting storytelling devices, and remove the unnecessary details that will bog them down, that's how you serve an audience. So again, Every time I do it, I try and think about sort of my ideal person. I generally pick my Auntie Ruth. She's 76. She lives in BC, in Port Alberni, and I try and give her a talk about, how to do things or what I know. And that's who I pitch it to. So here's a key about how your audience and when your audience will listen to you, because you do need your audience to listen. You do want to show enthusiasm and mastery of the subject because it gives you confidence. And we get stuck on this one. We think that mastery of the subject matter means that we have to overload our slides, fill our presentation with everything that's in our head, jargon and numbers and details, but you will lose your audience if you give them too many details. Likewise, we often overestimate an audience's background knowledge, especially when we're giving a research presentation. So we do need to kind of pitch it to make sure that the audience knows what they need to know in order to understand what you're talking about. So give them what they need, but you do need to meet them at their level. Don't overassume, don't underassume. It can be hard to pitch. The second thing is to show empathy for the audience and to connect. And so things like introducing yourself, things like using storytelling devices, we'll talk about that again in a second, to show empathy for the audience. Recognize that you're not probably the most interesting thing that's going to happen in their day today, and try and meet them at their level. When you lighten the background information and the content, it gives us space to showcase our enthusiasm and our confidence. If they have a question, a technical question, you can answer it. That's awesome. But that shows that conversation and connecting with the audience. But when you're giving that presentation, you want to head for that pretty high level, focus on the big picture, why something matters. And the ways to connect with the audience is to be in the moment. When you're in the room, which is ideal, and I'm sorry that I'm not in the room with you today, but to try and be in the moment, to look at the people, to pause, to comment on what you're seeing and hearing, to smile and laugh. Hard to do in a 3-minute presentation. You have a bit more room in a 10-minute presentation. To be personal, why did you do this work? What did you learn from it? We're going to talk about that and why that builds connection. But basically bringing it back to basics. The key is to help them understand why it matters. We're going to break that down in a second. But when your audience understands why you did the research work that you did, that also creates connection. They're like, oh, this is going to eventually help with older adults who have experienced falls. My grandma fell, she broke her hip. This is going to help. This is going to help other seniors who, maybe are going to fall and break their hip. It creates that sense of connection. You might be studying something that's really detailed and technical over here in the research world, but if you can back away and help them understand why your research matters, it gives you credibility and it creates that sense of connection to your audience. So that's audience. That's some of the things to think about when you talk about the audience. So the 3 parts of the presentation, the next thing that we're going to talk about is message. So message is sharing your work. What did the best storytellers do? They connect. This is my second book, Forest Prairie Edge, that I'm showcasing in this particular picture. Connecting to the audience means that you're the tour guide, you're the storyteller, and you're the cheerleader. So when it comes to sharing a research story, you're not just the researcher. You're sort of like the tour guide to the research. You're kind of walking with them and saying, okay, this is what we did and this is why we did it. And we'll break that down in a second. But you're also the cheerleader. No one else is going to get excited about your research unless you're excited. So make sure that any enthusiasm that you have, and hopefully you're not so tired of your research that you've lost your enthusiasm, try and put some enthusiasm and some excitement about your research into your work. That will help you. Okay, now we're going to get down to some nitty-gritty details of how to share your research story. This is one of my favorite showcases. These are the 4 components of a research talk. I call them the 4 horsemen of research communication, and they are why, how, what, and why. And you'll notice that why is there twice. So you start and you end with why, and I'll break that down. So the first why is, why were you interested in this? Why were you interested in this research? What got you interested in this particular subject matter, or what aspect of this research were you interested in? So why did you get going on this research? What was it that hooked you in? And if you share that hook, other people will say, oh yeah, I'm kind of interested in that too. Or I can see why you were interested in it. So you always want to start with why. The second is how. How did you study it? So a lot of people, this is where you'll talk about your research methods, how you set up your experiments if you did them, where you went to find your sources if you were doing a literature review of some kind. How did you study what you were interested in? How did you approach this particular research topic? The third is what. What did you find? So basically, yes, your results, but also, any kind of analysis or synthesis work that you might have done. What did you find? And the last again is, why does it matter? Why, how, what, why? Why does it matter? And when you can showcase why it matters, and that can matter on two different levels. We'll talk about that. Why does this research matter in this particular discipline to the larger area of research that it falls in? Or you can also talk about why it matters to you as a researcher. I learned these skills that I can then apply in these other ways, or I can take them in new directions. That's also a good way to talk about research, and that helps. Now, the beauty of this particular method is that it suits no matter how much time you have. If you have 3 minutes, you can craft a research talk that covers these 4 points in 3 minutes. If you have 10 minutes, all you do is that you've got time within each of these 4 sections to kind of open it up, give a few more examples, take them a little bit further into the research. You can expand within each section to fit the time that you have. So that's one of the reasons why I like to share why, how, what, why. Let's break each of these down. So why? I like to open with a hook. Why did I do this research? Some of the ways that you can do that is curiosity. We were curious about, or we wanted to know. Curiosity is we are all cats here at the university. And yes, research might kill us. The old saying, curiosity killed the cat. But still, curiosity is the center of research. You're curious about something you'd like to know. Another way to do it is a story clip. We were working on this, but then we saw this and we got really interested in that and we wanted to follow it. And so that happens. Or you can say, my grandma fell and she broke her hip. And so I got really interested in bone breaks in seniors, or whatever it is, however you got interested in your research work. You can also use an analogy or a metaphor. These are particularly helpful and powerful, especially if your work is really theoretical, very technical, or difficult to understand, especially if you did a lot of research work in a lab and something that you did is very technical. So if you start at that really, really high level and give them some analogies, that's really, really helpful and useful for your audience. And the last way that there are others, but these are just 4 examples. Another way to bring your audience and to open with a hook is to make a statement. Sometimes you can start with a fact, an opinion, a statistic, a declaration of some kind. And, we know that, 60% of the car accidents in Saskatchewan are from drunk drivers. Why do we have so many drunk drivers in Saskatchewan, or whatever it is that you're interested in? So these are some options of how to open with a hook. Why are you interested in this research? The second is how. How did you study this? So what was your research question? What was your methods? What was your study design? And again, you're aiming at that high level, and think about going back to serving your audience. You want them to walk with you as you're explaining your research. You want them to kind of come along for the whole journey. So you want to make sure that you tell them about your study design. This is what we decided to do, but keep it at a very high level. Really important, if your work is part of a larger study, let's say that you're working with a professor who has a really, really large research lab and they're studying this big topic, but you were only working on this tiny little corner of it. If your work is part of a larger study, say so and say how it fits. That's really important. Another thing that depending on how much time you have, sometimes works really well, and sometimes this works well in the questions, but you can say what the drawbacks were of your research design. It's like, we did it this way. We discovered after doing the research that we should have, maybe set up the design a little bit differently. If we were going to do it again, we would do it this way. Sometimes that's a really good thing to talk about because it showcases your mastery of the research talk. your mastery of the research that you did, and your mastery of your study design and its limitations. And that's really cool. You get extra bonus points for that usually. And the third is what? What did you find? So oftentimes it's your results, but in some cases it's more your synthesis or your analysis. So your analysis is part of it, your results, your synthesis. When you go to say what, it's a little bit different than why. So you're saying, what did you find? We found this and this and this. Don't move to interpretation until you've had at least a moment to kind of talk about what. This is what we found, and this is what we think it means. Those are two separate things. They're very closely related, but don't skip ahead to the first one without just saying, this is what we found, and this is what we think it means. Those are two separate things. But I do want to say that you can be very candid in this space. Are you just starting your analysis? This is your research design. You're just setting it up, and this is what we think, or what we're hoping we're going to find when I conduct my research. So be really specific to say where you're at in your research trajectory, and that really helps as well. Maybe when you were doing the literature search, you found a big hole or a gap. Talk about that. That might be where you're at in your research, is that you've identified this problem that you're about to work on, and that's okay too. Or sometimes people say the results were confusing and you're not quite sure what they mean. If you're direct and clear, that you say, we need to do a bit more work in this area, we're not 100% sure of what we're seeing, that's a perfect thing to talk about as well. One of the if you're far enough along in your research work, like let's say next spring that you're going to be presenting your honors work, and you're going to use the same thing: why, how, what, why. When people go to talk about the results, oftentimes you can use charts or graphs, but you have to make sure that they're really big, very obvious, and very visual. In an oral part of the presentation, your ability is to talk about the trends and the highlights and the big points. Don't get lost in the weeds of just repeating a bunch of numbers, because your audience will cut right off. So yes, you can have an image on the screen or on your poster if you're giving a presentation, but your job is to be able to explain what that chart says and how you interpret it, what that data says. So just remember that you're still the cheerleader and the storyteller and the tour guide to your research. All right. So the last one is why. Why does it matter? The implications. This is critical because it showcases your awareness of how and where your research fits into the larger research area where it belongs, what implications your particular project has had on the research, and maybe it's changed research directions or just filled in some gaps and holes and just added some more information, which is perfectly legitimate. But it's also a good idea in this moment to talk about what the implications of the research has had on you and who you'll be as a professional, who you'll be as a researcher, or maybe you're going to go on to be, you want to enter medicine or dentistry or anything like that. And you can talk about your knowledge of research and how that helps you to be a better professional in your future career. It also showcases your credibility and your mastery of the subject, because it shows how you understand how your research could potentially fit into the larger world. So that's really important. So some of the things that you can talk about in this, what do these results suggest? So back in the what did you find? Okay, this is what these results suggest. So this is the why does it matter? What impact does your research have? What's the end goal of the research? And what's the larger issue that maybe you're hoping to solve, or that, this is a small piece to work on this larger issue. So those are some of the things. So the why, how, what, why, those are the four. When you go to give your oral presentation, and I'm just going to go through a couple of points on this again, you want to make it as easy on the listener as you can. You want to get right to the point, use stories and analogies, give some context and background just to make sure that they're walking with you, but not too much. The other is communication keys. So things like no jargon. If you have to use an acronym, make sure you explain it. You want to use as honest language as you can, positive language. Try not to use double negatives. College of Medicine writes in double negatives all the time, but I was just adjudicating at the College of Medicine last week in the Dean's Projects, and the students that remembered to flip theirs into positive language instead of double negative ended up at the top of their heap. So if you, so that's something. Very active and confident, and bring your energy and your tone. One of the biggest communications goals is to stay within your time as much as you can. Plain language is your friend. It helps you connect with your audience. You want your audience to understand what you say the first time you say it. You don't want to have to stop and define words or use big words to sound smart, because if your audience doesn't know what you've just said, you've lost them. So strong, plain language is your friend. This is a cute little, I don't know if you guys remember Calvin and Hobbes. They were big in the 1990s. Calvin is a little kindergarten kid, and Hobbes is his stuffed toy. I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realized that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report? The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes. And he says, academia, here I come. As an academic, I've always loved this one, and I like to show it a lot. When you're giving that oral presentation, you know that you've got them and you've hooked them if they ask questions. If you've pitched it well and they're listening and they do have some background knowledge, they might ask you some more technical questions. And this is perfect. This is a time to get more technical if they ask for it. Again, other things you can talk about is what you would do differently if you could go back and do this research again. What's needed to get this research to the next level? What's the next logical step? And then what skills did you learn from this work? What are you taking with you? Here's a rule. If you've given an oral presentation and they ask something basic, like, what does that word mean? It means you've missed something really critical. So your learning in that case is that if you give that presentation again, make sure that you answer those questions right in the presentation. So that's why if you have a chance to practice beforehand, that's always a good idea. And we'll talk about that next. If they ask questions of any kind, that means they were engaged and they were listening and you've done a good job. Okay, so we have covered audience, we have covered message. The third part that we're going to talk about is the speaker, and that's you. And this is all about practicing. Practice, practice, practice. You're not going to pick up guitar and sing a song in public the first time without having practiced that thing several hundred times before you get up there. It's the same with the research talk. Do not get up and talk a research talk in front of people without practicing it first. Some of the things that I do is that I write and plan it out. So I think about what are my key points. I try and tell it like a story, and it's the same as that. So that why, what, how, and sorry, why, how, what, and how, or why? Oh my gosh. It's the same as if you took an English class and it talks about the hook, that's the introduction, the context, the rising action, that's what you did. So your research methods, your climax, what you discovered, and your finale is why does it matter? It's actually the same as a story. Your research tale is the same as a story. You want to write it out, and then you need to edit it back to basics. You're going to speak it out loud, because when you write, it's very different than when you speak. I always write it out, and then I sit here in my office and I read it out loud. And every time I trip, I have to go back and I take it out of my writing and I redo my writing until it sounds like how I would speak orally. And the reason why you do that is because you want that to be as smooth as possible. So this is the steps that I do. I read it out loud, I time myself, I revise it, I cut, I revise, fix all the places where I stopped and had trouble. I read it out loud again. When I think it's maybe close to ready and close to on time, I practice with an audience and see what happens. My daughter has listened to me give multiple research talks. Incorporate their feedback. If they got stuck anywhere, if there was something that they didn't understand, incorporate that, make sure you explain that. cut something else, practice again, and keep doing that. This will give you a really good oral research talk. Couple of technical things that I wanted to cover. Voice is part of the story. If you have a very quiet voice, you need to work on that. You need to work on your energy and your tone. You are on the stage. You need to warm up before your presentation. I warmed up before I went online with you guys. I did my big stretches, I did my power poses, I warmed up my voice, I did some humming to make sure that my voice was strong and that I was, especially considering I'm sitting and I'm away from you. I'm not physically in the same room as you guys. So I warmed up even more, knowing that I needed to be really energetic and dynamic in order to hold you. Even though I'm not in the room, I am still on stage. There are some voice tools and some tricks. You'll notice that sometimes I'm pacing fast, sometimes I'm pacing more slow, depending if there's a point that I really want to make sure that you guys get. When I'm in the room, I will probably do more work with pitching. Because I'm not physically in the room, I'm pitched quite high and quite strong at the moment. But sometimes I will work on pitch and I'll do things that are loud or soft, depending on where I'm at in the research talk. I also want to make sure that my tone is friendly and connecting. If you can, if you've done your work and you've got your thing timed well, you try not to rush. You want to give your audience time to process. The last thing I want to talk about is body language. To be powerful, particularly when you're physically in the room, do that power pose. Stand up and do the Wonder Woman power pose, shoulders back, chest up and big before you go in to give your research talk. And do the same thing before you go in to do an interview for a job. Go into the bathroom, close the door, do the power pose, and get your chest open and as big as you can. The more powerful you are, the more energy your body will have. I tell myself this all the time, but I'm terrible at it. Minimize hand movements and other distracting habits. I have a lot of distracting habits. I talk with my hands all the time. My brother-in-law says if you put my hands behind my back and tied them there, I wouldn't be able to talk. I still think I would, but he says I can't. I always talk with my hands. It can be distracting, and I apologize for that, but I've learned how to just incorporate that as part of my talk. Dress professionally, that should be a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised, especially in our COVID times, we got a bit sloppy in this way, but dressing professionally does matter. First impressions do matter. If you have time, try and record yourself and practice and watch for any strengths and weaknesses, and that will help you as well. You still have to be honest and who you are. If you have a quieter voice, tell your audience, I'm sorry, this is as big as my voice gets. Do your best and I will project as best as I can, and let's work together to walk through this presentation. Just be honest about who you are as a speaker and what you bring to the table. So that's the three parts: the speaker, the audience, and the message. And all three of those go together. And in order to give the best research talk you can, these are the three steps. The first one is to serve your audience. Think about who your audience is, serve that audience through connecting to them, showcasing confidence in what you're doing, and credibility. You are the master of your research, and you are going to walk them through your research and what you did. The second is your message, to share your research story. Why were you interested in it? How did you study it? What did you find? And why does it matter? So why, how, what, why? And that can be expanded or contracted depending on how much time you have. And the third is you as a speaker. You as the person, speak with as much confidence and clarity as you can. And if you can't, fake it. We all do. Practice will help you. More practice will help you more. Never go into an oral presentation without practicing it out loud several times if you can. And remember to warm up your body and warm up your voice. So the best research stories are memorable, understandable, and repeatable. So I want, when you guys see me on campus, I want you to remember, oh yeah, you gave that presentation on giving an oral research talk. Thanks so much. And that is the presentation. And now I welcome your questions. I'm 4 minutes over what I'd promised to be. I said 35 and I'm 39. See, I broke the first rule.
Well, it was worth it. That was the best research presentation talk that I've ever attended. I've picked some things up from you too. So that was fantastic. I know a lot of our students here are on their devices, but if people want to grab the mic, you can ask Dr. Massie a question. So it looks like we have one here. And I'm sure the SURE students, if you have questions, just pop it into the chat box as well. But we'll start with Amber here with a question.
Hi, Dr. Massie. Thank you for your talk today. I just had a quick question. Well, how do you deal when someone asks you a question? How do you deal when someone asks you a question that you don't necessarily know the answer to?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And people will sometimes do that to try and trip you up. And sometimes they're honestly curious, or their mind went sort of in a direction. What I do is, honesty is always your best policy, to say that I didn't consider that when I was doing this research. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. If you think that you maybe have an answer, or you can suggest, I think if I was going to address that, I might attack it in this way, and just be honest. And that's always the best policy. You will sometimes get research questions that you don't know the answer to, because you either didn't think about them when you were doing your research, or it's an adjacent kind of question to what you were actually studying. And you can be very specific about that. Sometimes they're asking you a question, you'll say, the way that we designed our research, we deliberately excluded that question for these reasons, or we knew that we didn't have the time to address that, and so we kept it out of our research methodology.
All right, thanks. Students in the classroom, do you have other questions? Or the SURE students? I can't see the chat box, so not sure.
I'm watching the chat box. So.
Okay, cool, great. I think one thing too, Dr. Massie, that I noticed with your presentation, and I don't think you addressed it, but your slides were not text heavy.
No, that's right. And so for those of you who don't know, one of the programs that I run is called the SURE program, so Student Undergraduate Research Experience. We've designed it so that any student across the U of S who is doing research, for example, like an honors, seminar like you guys are doing in kinesiology, we have developed a huge library of supports for any undergraduate student who's doing research. And Dr. Rebecca Benach from the Ron and Jane Graham School of Professional Development gives a great presentation on PowerPoint is not your friend, and it's super, because it really walks you through taking all that crap out of your PowerPoints, because that's people, they should just be there just to give people something to look at, and that's it. You don't want them to be text heavy. You don't want them to be heavy with graphs that you can't read. How many of you have been to a research talk where the PowerPoint is so horrible, like your head goes down, you're like, I can't even look at it, I can't see it, I don't understand it, I'm totally confused, I'm so dumb. That happens to me all the time.
I think too, when you're talking about having a powerful position when you're talking, I've noticed with our honor students in past years, as well as some of my own graduate students, that the screen is up here, and lots of times people will turn and talk to the screen.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're taking their voice away from the audience.
Yeah, so if you need to look at the screen, go walk to the back of the room. Because then everybody can still hear you, and you're still talking to the screen, but you're also talking to the rest of the room. So if you have to look at the screen, walk to the back of the room. That's a really easy fix for that particular problem. But I've seen it happen. When I'm giving a presentation in person, I wander around the room a lot. So I rarely just stand up at the front. It is a good visual cue. It keeps everybody in the audience kind of more awake, because they're like, oh yeah, okay, I'm not actually doing Facebook behind my laptop here in the back row or whatever. There's a great question that came in on the chat. How do you feel about cue cards or notes? I usually present without any notes, but I will occasionally miss a point or a story I wanted to include, but didn't want to include on the slide. I always have cue cards or notes. When I'm giving, especially especially if I'm giving a really public talk. So I was in Regina at Government House in March on International Women's Day, and I was giving a presentation. So the Lieutenant Governor was there, the Mayor of Regina was there, and I was the guest speaker. I actually had my iPad and I had the whole thing written out, but I'd practiced it so much that I was able to look at the audience, but I could still keep going with my iPad so that I knew, where I was at, and I had, sort of different cue card endpoints there. I usually still keep notes with me. I'll print them up, usually 14 font at least, or even 16 to make it really, really big. And just so that, because you get nervous in the moment, right? Or you kind of accidentally go off on a tangent. Happens all the time. But if you've practiced it, you'll be able to automatically whoop and be back on track.
Other questions? Any in the chat box?
I don't see anything. One of the things that I always try and I had to learn this as a student myself is that nobody else did the research, right? Like, unless you've done a group project and you've all done the research together. But if you're doing an individual project, there is nobody else who understands your research as well as you do. Like, they're not, like, even if it's your supervisor, they still don't understand the research as well as you do, because you're the one that you've been filtering it all through your brain. You are the master of your research. Nobody else is going to be there to like trip you up and like, trick you or something. You are the master. And so try and remember that, because if that helps to give you confidence, that is the toughest thing to overcome, to have confidence to give a presentation.
I think too, what's important for our honor students to understand is when you're proposing your research, you are the experts,
yeah.
But there's also room, there should be room in your mind to be open to input that people give, and maybe consider including that, whatever point they brought up, into your research. So you're the expert, but also be open-minded, I think, is important.
Absolutely. I think that that's brilliant. And so there's the difference between, giving a research presentation when you're done your research versus giving a research presentation earlier in the research, which is where the kinesiology students are going to end up being. So you're talking about where so an analogy from my work is when I did my PhD and I had to give, I had to write up what I thought I was going to do and what I thought my research was going to be about, and how I was going to do it. And then, but I had to present it and then receive the feedback from everybody on my committee and kind of figure out ways to take in what they thought might be helpful or that might strengthen my research, and sort of pick the best bits and pieces of what the feedback that they gave me to make my own research work stronger.
No research is perfect. And I think sometimes, we have such high functioning honor students that it's the honors experience or research experience is so different, because you never know all the answers and you're never going to, but having that open-mindedness and then being able to defend it when you get to your final presentation is really important. By then you for sure are the experts.
Absolutely. There's a question in the chat. Do you like when people flip through their slides to answer a question? If the visual cue will help you answer the question, then absolutely, that's fine. If the visual cue, if you're just doing it to kind of say, oh my God, you weren't paying attention, well, maybe that's a bit rude.
It's looking like we don't have any more questions in our physical room. So anyone online?
No, I've been watching the chat. So thank you all very much. Look at that, 2 minutes to spare. Off you go to your next class.
Well, before everyone takes off, Dr. Massie, I just really wanted to thank you again. That was a fantastic presentation. And like I said, I learned from it as well. And I know you'll be posting it on the YouTube channel, and I'll make sure I give that information out to the honor students here in Kin. So thank you so much, Dr. Massie, and hopefully next time you'll come back and we can see you in person maybe.
Yes, no, that sounds good. And I apologize. I'm very strict with my schedule, and with the roads being so gross, it gave me another reason to not drive in this morning. Sorry, but I appreciate, but I guess another thing that it shows today is that you can give an oral presentation virtually and still do a reasonable job.
A fantastic job. Oh,
Thanks, everyone.
Hold on, Dr. Massey. We have one
Okay.
more question, it looks like.
Sure.
Hold on.
What are your opinions on using virtual backgrounds when giving virtual presentations versus
Absolutely.
just having an organic background?
Yeah, absolutely. That's personal preference. Lots of people do. Sometimes if you're giving a presentation at a conference, they will give you a background that they want you to use. I've seen that. The University of Saskatchewan has a whole bunch of backgrounds for their Zoom that we can choose to use. This is my home office, and I'm perfectly fine with you guys having a view of my home office. I think that it creates that sense of connection. You know, this is my most recent book. This purple thing over here was a blanket that my aunt bought when I was born in 1971. So, you know, like there's and I have, you know, a lot of books because I'm a historian. So like, to me, it just kind of gives you a sense of who I am as a person. And so I choose to use my real background, but you don't have to. Absolutely. A virtual background is perfectly reasonable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.